Thank you, sir. As we are running short of time, we shall now straightaway proceed to the first Aijazuddin Ahmad Memorial Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Atiya Habib Kidwai. The lecture is being chaired by Janab Sohail Hashmi. May I request members from the organizing committee to kindly escort Janab Sohail Hashmi and Professor Atiya Habib Kidwai to the dais. Janab Sohail Hashmi, the chair for the memorial lecture, has been a freelance historian, heritage expert, linguist, and filmmaker. He has contributed to the domain of teaching and learning in geography with his textbooks for school. A recipient of INTAC Heritage Award in 2022, Janab Hashmi has authored Sachi, Where Tigers Fly and Lions Have Horns, as a part of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of India series. May I request the organizers to felicitate Janab Sohail Hashmi. Thank you. Professor Atiya Habib Kidwai is a geographer and a professionally trained regional planner from IIT Kharagpur. Her teaching and research, spanning almost half a century, includes 3 years at the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, IIT Kharagpur, 41 years at the Center for Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and 5 years at the Department of Regional Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. She has been a Rhodes Visiting Scholar and a Senior Fulbright Fellow at the Universities of Chicago and Illinois. She has had a long and multifaceted interaction with French geography and geographers as the Director of Studies at Maison des Sciences Léon, Paris, and 3 times visiting professor at universities in Paris. She was a founder member of the International Geographical Union Commission on Third World Development and Director of the Training Workshop of the Commonwealth Geographical Bureau held in India. She has served as a member of National Commission for Promotion of Social and Economic Welfare, Ministry of Finance, Government of India, the National Capital Region Planning Board, India, the Delhi Urban Arts Commission, and various bodies of the Institute of Town Planners, India. May I request the members of the organizing committee to kindly felicitate ma'am. May I now request Professor Sachidanand, President of IIG, to kindly speak about the first Aijazuddin Ahmad Memorial Lecture.
Okay. Yeah, friends, it's an honor to introduce the 2 dignitaries this morning, particularly within the framework of the first memorial lecture that we are going to have in honor of Professor Ahmad. In fact, this is long overdue. We should have started this almost a decade before, but better late than never. I believe both the chair and the speaker, they have had a very long association with Professor Ahmad. Professor Atiya Habib Kidwai joined JNU a little before Professor Ahmad joined, and therefore she had a long innings to associate with him, and therefore has seen the department, both the CSRD and the curriculum developed together along with Professor Ahmad. And सोहेल हाशमी साहब पहले बैच के स्टूडेंट हैं उस सेंटर के जहां प्रोफेसर अहमद आए, तो मेरे ख्याल से उनसे बेहतर कोई इन दो लोगों से बेहतर कोई नहीं सोच सकते थे हम, और हमें बहुत खुशी है कि आप दोनों यहाँ पे तशरीफ़ लाए हैं, और हमारा तो मान बढ़ा ही है, और ख़ास करके ये एक होमेज होगा हमारे उस जोग्राफ़र के लिए और सोशल साइंटिस्ट के लिए जिन्होंने जोग्राफ़ी को एक नया मकाम पे पहुंचाया और एक नया रुख भी दिया। तो मुझे उम्मीद है कि आप सभी प्रोफेसर अहमद के काम को भी देखेंगे। बस एक गुजारिश रहेगी कि अगर अंत में थोड़ा सा समय मिलेगा तो हम एक छोटी वीडियो है वो भी हम दिखाने की कोशिश करेंगे, जो कि, और उसके लिए आप थोड़ा जमे रहें तो अच्छा है। शुक्रिया।
May I request the Chair, Janab Sohail Hashmi, to kindly take over the proceedings.
I had never in my wildest dreams imagined that I'll be chairing a session where Professor Atiya Habib will be speaking. Atiya Appa is my senior. When I joined JNU in the first MA batch, Atiya Appa was already doing her PhD, and she introduced us to an entirely new discipline because we hadn't studied that in our college. That was urban geography. And my association with Atiya Appa and with Aijaz Sahab lasted fairly long. I did my MA there, I did my MPhil there, and I also worked on a PhD which I didn't finish finally. But for that period, Atiya Appa and Aijaz Sahab were there. And they were guides and they were inspirations. So it is, I am grateful to the organizers for giving me the honor to chair this session. And Atiya Appa will speak about Aijaz Sahab, or will give a memorial lecture, the first memorial lecture. And I am really grateful for the IIG for having instituted this memorial lecture. Because Aijaz Sahab was one of those people who made a seminal contribution in transforming geography as it had been taught during the colonial period into a subject that could grow into a social science. And the engagements of Aijaz Sahab, his study of linguistic diversity, his contribution to accessibility and denial of accessibility and its impact on education, especially among marginalized communities, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and how inbuilt biases in a society operated through things that were presented to you as natural barriers. And it is, we began to look at natural barriers. How is it that there are natural barriers only for the deprived, and there are no natural barriers for the privileged? And this is when you started looking at geography not merely as a list of cities, towns, heights, population, but the impact of all that on human lives. And the idea that you had to generate data, and then you had to analyze that data, and then you had to formulate your theories based on your data generation, and then you had to go and test it in the field, and then gradually evolve a situation where a discipline which is the highest mountain in India, which is the broadest river in India. This is what we were taught in schools and even in colleges. From that to move into social geography, into economic geography, into human geography, this is the change that happened. And this is the change that happened primarily through the contributions of people like Aijaz Sahab. So and I am now a failed geographer, but all those who are professionally as teachers, professors, academics in the field of geography, we need to understand this, that it is the work of people like Aijaz Sahab that has made geography into a discipline that impinges deeply on our own understanding of this country. So it's a great honor for me personally to be able to be invited here to preside over this, and I'll humbly request Atiyapa to deliver the first Professor Aijaz Ahmad Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
I think I'll stand. Can you see me? Yeah. You can take it somewhere else. I don't need that. Okay. Good afternoon. I think it's already 12. Okay. I have a bad throat, so I might, I just have to wait and rest it for a while in between my talk. I wish to thank IIG for giving me this opportunity to commemorate one of my valued teachers and a much regarded colleague at JNU for almost 3 decades, Professor Aijazuddin Ahmad. Professor Ahmad was someone I grew up with as a geographer. To celebrate him as my teacher, in fact with him celebrate all my teachers, I will talk about my academic journey and about those teachers who were my co-wayfarers. Walking along with them, I became who I am today. Geography as a separate, well-established discipline in India is 100 years old, and I have been fortunate to have shared almost 60 years of this journey. The discipline has a wide kaleidoscopic canvas, and in my talk today, I will try to remember the geographers who have painted this canvas for me. There is nothing in the script that is academically profound or even useful, and I hope my students here will forgive me for this rambling. I only wish to acquaint you with some of the geographers who wrote the books that you may have read or the research papers that you may have consulted. I assure you it will be useful to know them not only as your teachers, but also as the beautiful human beings that they were. When you are reading a book, you unconsciously develop an image of the personality of the author. When I started my research on colonial cities in the early 1970s, the only book that addressed my intellectual curiosity was T.G. McGee's The Urbanization Process in the Third World, published in 1971. It became my Bible and McGee my messiah. For me, McGee was a ponderous, very serious, lost in thought person. But in 1980, I had the great opportunity of spending a fortnight with him in a conference at the East West Center, Hawaii. Over my stay, I discovered that this profound thinker was also a simple, unassuming, fun-loving man who, while traveling in India, had slept in dharamshalas and had a heart full of warmth and empathy for the third world. His books for me since then speak a different language. I had sent my very nostalgic and autobiographical version of this paper to Sachidanand a few days ago when his sword was hanging on my head to submit something. I had to delete major portions of it to be able to present it to you today. In this talk, I wish to share with you the times and circumstances that shaped students of geography of my generation. When I say my generation, I refer to the cohort which after passing class 10th entered the intermediate or degree colleges in or around the 1960s. I was I will focus mostly on the formative decades of geography from the 1970s to the 1990s. In the subsequent decades, my students became my co-wanderers as heads of departments, consultants, professors, bureaucrats, and even a prime minister. I will talk about them some other day. The early decades of geography in India were not ordinary times for the discipline, as it was just beginning to find its feet in the country and spread out from a few well-established universities, mostly in North India, into newer universities. The discipline was also trying to come out of the British mold. Geography faculty was groping tentatively for the research areas to initiate in their departments, and at the same time struggling to shed the influence of their foreign mentors, who were strong academics and very strong personalities. I begin by foregrounding my reminiscences with my school days in the mid-1950s. I got my education up to class 10 in a small convent school in a then small railway town called Gorakhpur in eastern Uttar Pradesh. If you look back at your childhood, somewhere lurks a school teacher or two who determined what subjects were going to be your favorites. My favorite teacher was a geography teacher, Mrs. Luther. Geography was taught through Dudley Stamp's books. Only in higher classes, our teaching was done through books by Indian writers. I do not remember who wrote those Indian books in geography, but we depended on books called Kunji in Hindi, which meant keys to a subject. These were written by some enterprising young teachers and printed on cheap paper. These Kunjis were our Google. Dudley Stamp's narration of Indian regions used to trigger my imagination about the then far-off places in South India from where my Madrasi friends came. In those days, anyone coming from deep south was called a Madrasi in North India. Dudley Stamp introduced me to Burma, now Myanmar, a country I found exciting because my uncle had fought there in the World War II for the British Army. Little did I know that one day I would have a changed opinion about Dudley Stamp and also about the innocent terms he was using, such as the tropics and tropical geography, which symbolized colonial expansion, imperialism, racism, and Eurocentrism. Dudley Stamp was a strong supporter of the empire, one might even say complicit in empire, and had greatly influenced the Royal Geographical Society, the IGU, and the teaching of geography in India and Britain in those early days. He was knighted in 1965 and was much awarded by associations of geography all over the world. Such were the times. I would like to digress here and, as a backdrop, give some important milestones in the development of the discipline in geography. One may even ask, who is the father of Indian geography? By consensus, the answer is James Rennell. He's known as the father of oceanography too. He was a surveyor and engineer in the East India Company and was deputed to survey the Bengal River system and map it for exploring inland waterways for trade. Are you showing those? Okay. Geography began to be taught in schools in India in the later part of the 19th century, since it was considered beneficial for those who would like to join the army or were in the East India Company's services. Formal geography departments in India started being opened in the late 1920s. The year of their establishment in the major universities and the geographers, mostly from the second generation with whom I had the privilege to interact, is given in this table. It may be of interest to know that the Department of Geography at Rangoon University is 4 years older than any Indian department. It was set up by Professor Dudley Stamp and his wife using the curriculum of London University. In 1937, O.H.K. Spate, who joined it for some years when he did not get a job in England, he was part of the faculty. Spate, although brilliant and original, was considered too radical for a conventional academic career in England, so the British universities would not accommodate him. The geographical associations and societies founded during the colonial period played a vital role in disseminating geographical knowledge and promoting geographical research. Journals like The Geographer, published from Aligarh in 1925, Geographical Journal, published from Madras in 1926, the Geographical Review of India, published from Calcutta in 1936, and the Bulletins of National Geographical Society of India, published from BHU in 1946, popularized geography. Geography at the graduation level in the 1960s, I would talk about them now. My 4 years of intermediate, that is class 11th and class 12th in those days, and 2 years of graduation were spent at Loreto Convent College at Lucknow. Those 4 years of geography between 1960 and 1964 were dull as the teachers kept changing and nothing exciting happened in the classes. The only redemption was that the college library, where I was a student helper, was quite well equipped and I had free access to an almirah full of well-chosen textbooks. I learned geography on my own. Urban geography interested me the most. Self-teaching was an enjoyable experience, but created a sort of distance from the subject. When I look back, nothing very exciting was happening in urban geography and other places of learning in India too. Most graduate students were being taught urban morphological models developed by Chicago School, by Mayer, Ullman, and Harris. Their work on functional classification of towns and the work of German geographers Losch and Christeller were drilled into us. The first anthology of papers published in urban geography, which was Harold Mayer's Readings in Urban Geography, was published in 1959. This became our basic text. We were unaware of the radical change that was taking place in geography in the early 1960s by Ullman and Garrison's students at the University of Washington that came to be labeled as quantitative geography. The full ramifications of this change were, however, revealed at the University of Chicago by Brian Berry a few years later. But for my generation in India, we had to wait to become aware of this revolution until we reached our post-graduation in the mid-1960s. My post-graduation was done at AMU, and they were wondrous 2 years for me, and these were between 1964 and 1966. After I graduated, I was restless and confused because I wanted to have a career other than teaching. Teaching was the oft-beaten track for middle-class women at that time. I wanted to do something different. Fortunately, a timely chance meeting with a relative of a family friend decided on my career option to my satisfaction. He was freshly minted as an urban and regional planner from IIT Kharagpur after obtaining an MA in geography from BHU. I shared my plight with him and he advised me that I could consider following his career path and get a master's degree in geography, which would get me into architecture and regional planning either at IIT Kharagpur or at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi. I considered this option seriously, and since Lucknow University did not have a geography department, I decided to head for Aligarh Muslim University, where I was told the departments were very good. The year was 1964. I will now go into a little non-academic digression and talk to you about the Department of Geography at AMU, in which me and Professor Aijaz's early academic world was chiseled. Since Suhail Hashmi Sahab, the chair of the session, has spent his childhood in AMU, this may resonate with him. I like to call him Sahab today. All my student life until I reached AMU was spent in convents. My school was run by Carmelite nuns from Kerala and my college by Irish nuns. They created for us a cocooned, caring world of rules and regulations. The freedoms allowed were limited to the realms of the sports you could choose to play or the stray thoughts which you thought and which could not be controlled by them. I found that AMU was somehow similar. It was still a university with many old traditions intact and some old world conservatism. The department did not have its own building and was situated in a portion of the oldest boys' hostel, which is called the SS Hall of the university, and it faced the stadium grounds. The classes were held on the first floor and were accessed by a staircase inside the building. I was instructed by my senior women students not to use this inside staircase as it was meant for the faculty and for the male students only. But I had to use the one staircase which was at the rear of the building. This staircase was constructed in the early 1930s for Asafia Kidwai, the first woman student of the department. She was still working in the university as the head of the Department of Geography in the Women's College and was a legend. This restriction was the first alarm bell that rang for me in Aligarh. The second alarm bell rang for me later in the day. I had from my childhood days been allowed to use a bicycle to go to school or to college because the roads used to be safe and distances were easily negotiable. I had carried my bicycle to Aligarh. I had also been a little intrigued when I noticed that there were only 2 other cycles in the corridors of the hostel. On the first day of my cycling journey to the department with 2 of my classmates on a rickshaw, I did see some surprised faces on the way. Once I reached the department, I looked around for a place to park, found a cycle stand near the rear staircase, which I had been told to use to reach my classroom, and I parked there. Then took the staircase, which landed me in a small room where 2 girls were sitting. It was a waiting room for girls where we were supposed to stay and keep peeping into the classroom through the door to see if the boys had settled in their chairs and the teacher had arrived and taken the podium. We had to then walk quietly into the classroom and sit on the front benches. This was meant for girls. The girls had to immediately leave the room after the teacher finished lecturing and had to go back to the small cloister and wait for the next class. I've given a picture, I think it's of the history department in the 1940s, when girls were put behind a curtain in a classroom, but the girls did go to study. Our first class was taken by Professor Shafi, the head of the department. In measured tones, he told us about the MA course requirements. He was going to teach us physical geography and geomorphology. The basic textbooks and the must-reads were going to be the classics in physical geography, Woolridge and Morgan, Stroller, and Monkhouse. For each topic, there was also going to be a supplementary book. I wonder how many now read those classics which we were made to read from the contents to the last page. Soon after the class, the second warning bell rang for me. My cycle episode had been narrated to Professor Shafi by the department's PN, who was also his reporter. I was summoned, offered a chair, and then in the same measured tone in which he gave his lectures, he asked why I preferred a cycle to a cycle rickshaw. I fumbled something about convenience. After this unsatisfactory answer from me, he asked me where I had parked my cycle. I replied at the only stand near the department that I could see. I was told that the cycle stand was for the boys and I should not be using it. I should bring my bicycle inside the building and park it in the space the faculty uses for their cycles. Faculty members those days used to either walk or cycle to the department. I was quite intimidated, but I soon realized I was wrong. In a very conservative society, most rules for women in AMU had been made for their safety and to safeguard the reputation of the institution. Many girls were first-generation admission seekers in a co-educational institution, and their courageous initiative was not to be jeopardized. We soon found out that until our previous batch, girls were not even allowed to use the department's library after classes were over, and were not allowed on the yearly Bharat Darshan geographical tour. Not being allowed to use the best geography library in India suffocated me. One day I mustered up the courage to speak to Professor Shafi about this. He asked me to give him time and to think about it and to consult the faculty. After 2 days, we were called from a little room and were told that we could stay in the library until 4 p.m. Classes used to be over by 1 p.m. This gave us girls 3 hours of library time. From the day this permission was given, Professor Shafi stopped going home for lunch and stayed in the department as long as we were there in the library. To our surprise, we were even allowed to accompany the class for the Bharat Darshan Yatra. 2 battles were won and 2 new traditions were set, peacefully and quietly. We, however, obediently continued to use our separate staircase because it was historic and legendary. I gradually realized that in this almost surrealistic world, created not by any brand of fundamentalism, but by ingrained traditions and a culture all its own, there were freedoms allowed that would help a student to fully explore his or her academic potential in AMU. The department was like a big family, and the teachers kept a protective eye on both men and women students. Dissent was tolerated if expressed within the limits of propriety. Debate was encouraged. Girls were not only led, but could lead. The faculty in the department was exceptional in many ways, academically accomplished, affectionate, and very friendly. A few of them were quite radical, all others progressive and liberal. Professor Aijaz was the youngest member of the faculty, inducted 2 years ago in 1962. Professor Monis Raza was no longer a part of the faculty when I joined the department. He had left the university for other assignments. Fortunately, he continued to visit the department for a seminar or a lecture, and that gave us occasion to meet him. He kept track of me as an external examiner for some of my papers. Among the senior faculty, Professor Shafi, Professor Anas, and Professor Raza had been batchmates in their MA course. For doctoral work, Professor Shafi had proceeded to the London School of Economics and was mentored by Dudley Stamp. Professor Anas went to Australian National University to work with OHK Spate, and Professor Raza never submitted himself to a mentor. After his post-graduation, he found what he considered a more meaningful occupation for him. He spent most of his time staying underground in Kanpur to organize factory labor. Underground because the freedom movement was on and he was a member of the CPI. He lost one of his lungs to tuberculosis in this period while he was underground. He was taken to Czechoslovakia, where one of his lungs was taken out, and for the rest of his life, he just lived on one lung. Professor Muzaffar Ali, one of the very senior geographers of the country and their teacher, who later went and set up the Sagar University Geography Department, had taught all three of them. His reported observation about them was, Shafi is diligent, Anas is intelligent, and Monis is sharp. All three proved themselves completely worthy of the observation of the teacher. I will here only now talk about two geographers at AMU who laid the foundation of my understanding of cities and regions, the two geographical entities that became my concern when I pursued my career in urban and regional planning. Urban geography was taught by Dr. Aziz Tonki. He was a light-hearted storyteller about cities and their growth processes. He introduced us to some interesting readings before plunging us into Christaller, Ziff, and Ullman and Harris. We began with Lewis Mumford's The City in History. That book treats the city as the actor in a narrative written in an ornate, organic style. It leads you to critical thinking about cities historically grew as three-dimensional spatial units with all the beauty and all the ugliness man could create in them. As the course proceeded, my decision to pursue urban planning as a career was reinforced. Fortunately, during my post-graduation, urban geography was being shaken out of its monotony by Brian Berry, who was publishing feverishly at the University of Chicago. He had begun by refining the central place theory and had introduced the analysis of urban systems, which eventually laid the foundation of analytic urban geography. Our library gave us easy access to all that Brian Berry was writing. Professor Anas introduced us to regions in geography. He was a very treasured student of OHK Spate, the regional geographer par excellence. Spate, who was, we were told, treated Anas Sahab like his own son, and there was a great bond between them because once swimming together, Anas Sahab had saved Spate from drowning. Professor Anas could make regions come alive in a bewildering interplay of myriad regional processes created by nature and shaped by man. In his class, regions transcended their physicality, be it the Nile Valley, the primitive Papua New Guinea, or the diverse monsoon-washed South Asia. Professor Aijaz had recently completed his doctoral work on the Indian desert and had joined the faculty. He was assigned to design a course based on his thesis. It was the first time in the department that such a recognition was given to a doctoral thesis and to a doctoral student. We were the second batch he taught. He looked stern and serious all the time. Our first class with him began with the usual protocol. We generally avoided looking at the teachers, but out of curiosity, I stared at him. A very young face with a small build, unimposing, someone who could easily go unnoticed. When he started to speak, the class was initially startled and then mesmerized. He gradually unfolded before us vista upon vista of the great Indian desert. It was regional geography at its best. He had imbibed the spirit of teaching from Professor Anas, his mentor, and to it he added a very grounded understanding of how to teach regional geography of special regions. He rendered his wisdom in lucid prose and shades of poetry, the hallmark of all his lectures. Little did we know that Professor Aijaz also had a rare sense of wit and charitable sarcasm until he demonstrated in a remark he noted on the tutorial submitted by one of our batchmates. We had been asked to elaborate on some environmental issues highlighted in his thesis. This classmate, in a very neat handwriting, copied verbatim from the thesis, thinking that Aijaz Saab would not look at his sessional minutely enough to identify his own words. The sessional was returned by Professor Aijaz with a noting on each page, attested true copy. He had also signed on the margins of each page as is done in an affidavit. I considered it my great privilege that I was introduced to the multidimensionality of regions by two extraordinary geographers. They taught me how to become one with the region's society, its culture, and the joys and sorrows of its inhabitants. This helped me immensely when I was to understand the regions as a planner. Our interactions with other geography departments while I was at AMU. Since the geography departments were few in India, we knew most of their senior faculty because they were invited to conferences, lectures, or practical examinations. The most frequent were visits by faculty from BHU, Allahabad, Sagar, Jaipur, and Jamia because of their proximity. Our interaction with BHU was special as Professor R.L. Singh and Professor Shafi had both been students of Dudley Stamp, and Professor Kayastha, a revered senior teacher at BHU, had been a student of our department at AMU. I particularly remember two professors whom we found very amusing. Professor Gananathan and Professor C.D. Deshpande, both from the Pune University. In conferences, Professor Gananathan would sit in a corner of the room with no sign of any concentration on his face, his imperious cigar hanging from his mouth, and then suddenly he would sort of wake up during the discussions and ask the trickiest question. Professor Deshpande, on the other hand, would absorb as much as his patience allowed him in a seminar session, and then would take out his newspaper to solve crossword puzzles. We once caught him on camera. I think you can. This is Professor Deshpande. Professor Ahmad continued to enliven the geography classes at Aligarh while I left the department in 1966 for IIT Kharagpur to pursue a degree in regional planning. However, the charisma of the AMU Geography department was such that it always remained my second home. I visited the department as often as I could. Professor Aijaz would now meet me on a different plane, and gradually my fear of him waned. I was now part of his inner circle during conferences, where he regaled us during his parody sessions held secretly in the evenings. The stalwarts of geography were observed keenly during the day, and then parodies were written about them by him. I wished I had preserved those parodies. My next leap into the future was into the regional planning department at IIT Kharagpur. My obsession to study something different had left only one avenue for me after my MA, and that was a course in urban and regional planning. In 1966, there were only two institutions in India that offered professional courses in the field. My natural choice was the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi, but it had no hostel for girls, I was told. So I looked up IIT Kharagpur and I applied there. Since there were only 35 women in the entire IIT at that time in all departments, the director was always keen to admit women candidates. I was admitted along with another girl from BHU. Only two of us had applied, two women candidates had applied. The director later told me that I was the first Muslim girl who was seeking admission to an IIT, so he would have never said no to me even if I was a very average student. The director was Professor V.N. Prasad, an architect planner trained in London, who had prepared the first regional plan for the Damodar Valley Corporation, the DVC, about which we have all studied in school. He had also started the first professional degree level training course in regional planning at IIT and had established the Institute of Town Planners, which later shifted to Delhi. There was only one geographer teacher in the department, Dr. C.R. Patha. Pathak, who initially worked on the DVC plan with Dr. Prasad and was later absorbed into the faculty. We were the first batch of regional planners admitted for a degree course that was between 1966 and 1968 at IIT Kharagpur. The faculty was borrowed from other departments and was a mixed bag of architects, civil engineers, and one economist, and also one sociologist. The lack of appropriate faculty was made up by the visiting faculty. The geographers who visited us most frequently were Dr. L.S. Bhatt and Dr. K.V. Sundaram, and an eminent urban economist, Dr. A.N. Bose. We would occasionally also get academically inclined bureaucrats to lecture us. Exceptional among them was Badal Sarkar, the chief planner of the Calcutta Metropolitan Planning Organization. He was also a very radical playwright who had scripted two acclaimed plays of those days, Evam Indrajit and Pagla Ghoda. His lectures were a treat. The teaching at IIT was different from what I was used to at the university. There were very few formal lectures by the faculty. Our class consisted of architects, civil engineers, and geographers. The teacher would come to class, give a physical planning related problem, drop some hints, and then leave it to us to complete the work, say within 3 days or within very strict time deadlines. Both regional and urban planning was taught in those days was drawing board based and design oriented planning. Regional planning was just evolving and there were no textbooks written yet. Fortunately, in 1967, that was in my final year, John Friedman and William Alonso edited book Regional Development and Planning a Reader was published. It became our savior. Though it was an edited anthology of published papers, it at least made these papers available to us. We were also handicapped as we had only 2 core faculty members for the course, Dr. C.R. Pathak, the only geographer, and Dr. G.B.K. Rao, a civil engineer with some expertise in planning legislation. So most of the time in the classroom, Dr. Pathak would come, teach, go, Dr. G.B.K. Rao would come and teach, go, then Dr. Pathak would come and teach, go. So this was the daily routine. The one important thing we imbibed from this multidisciplinarity was that we learned how to think coherently in many directions and then learned to web this diverse knowledge into a meaningful planning solution. We also learned the art of visual presentation of our ideas. Some notable developments were taking place in a department in which I had got involved. In 1967, Walter Izard at the University of Pennsylvania had been looking for institutional affiliation for Regional Science Association International in India. He approached our institute and Professor Prasad as the director readily agreed. The onus of starting the India chapter of the Regional Science Association was put on Dr. Pathak and through him on his students. I and my batchmate R.N. Chattopadhyay, whom some of you may know, is one of the best rural development planners in the country. We did all the initial legwork of the Association for the Regional Science. After the first year, the course required us to do an internship in a government planning department for 3 months. After those 3 months of official planning, I knew that was not what I wanted to do. That is, make master plans for cities where people were just a number and all one did was to calculate the hectares of land needed for roads, houses, hospitals, schools, etc. By the time I reached the penultimate dissertation stage, I was very disillusioned by the design-oriented data-based planning. The final review of our performance was done by the Chief Town Planner, Government of India. He offered me a job of TCPO where he worked, that is the Town and Country Planning Organization, which was based in Delhi. And Professor Prasad, the director, offered 3 faculty positions to our class. R.N. Chattopadhyay and I were selected for 2 of them. I accepted the position. Teaching had finally allured me. Dr. Pathak and R.N. Chattopadhyay were my colleagues now. Together we tried to give a new direction to the regional planning coursework. We studies on regional disparities. We launched the Indian Journal of Regional Science in 1968 and organized an international regional science conference at the Gokhale Institute in Pune in 1969. This conference was attended by many economists who became luminaries later on. Walter Izard was the chief guest. These early years of my teaching between 1969 and 1971 were politically disturbed nationally and internationally. The Vietnam War had peaked and anti-war protests had spread all over the world. In the USA, many university professors were asking the US government fundamental and hard questions. The student movement for educational reforms were in full force in Europe. Mao Zedong's China was questioning the four olds, the old in ideas, culture, customs, and habits. Closer home, Indira Gandhi was in power. After some turmoil, the Bangladesh war had been won. The refugees were all over West Bengal. The Naxalite movement was spreading and was being policed. The beating and the cries of Naxals could be heard in the campus police station, which was next to my residence. It was very unnerving. Many academic and non-academic questions had started bothering me as a teacher too. It was an intellectually restless period for many of us. Some chance happenings led me to leave Kharagpur in June 1971 for JNU. Bengal had grown on me in those 5 years. I loved it. It was emotionally not an easy decision, but leave I must. The call came from JNU in 1970. While at Kharagpur, I was selected to go to Poland for a year to associate with a leading advocate of socialist spatial planning, Piotr Zaremba. I went to Delhi for my travel formalities and met Professor Raza because I wanted to share with him my excitement about my first trip to a foreign land. He was now a professor of geography and the think tank for a new university being established. This was the Jawaharlal Nehru University, housed in 2 rooms in annex of Vigyan Bhavan. He took me to meet the Vice Chancellor, Mr. G. Parthasarathy, a career diplomat. GP, he was called. GP's charisma captivated me. In a very pleasant and brief conversation, he had unearthed my CV. After a couple of months, I was contacted by Professor Raza's younger brother, Professor Mehdi, who had been my teacher at AMU. The newly formed Center for the Study of Regional Development at JNU had advertised for some posts, and I was asked to apply. I discussed this with Dr. Pathak. He had seen the advertisement and was keen on one of the senior posts and suggested that both of us could give JNU a try. The play of subsequent events landed me and Dr. Pathak in JNU. Poland had to be shelved at GP's behest. JNU, for me, was a big leap into uncertainty. Module by module, GP and Professor Raza had conceptualized the idea of a postgraduate university for a country like India, unified yet diverse, inclusive, egalitarian, and academically innovative. The academic program was designed differently. Instead of compartmentalized departments, centers of studies were carved based on core social science disciplines. Each center used to incorporate allied disciplines, converged them, interacted with them, and amalgamated them. Professor Raza vigorously tested this multidisciplinary approach at the Center for the Study of Regional Development, his own center. He was leading a diverse flock of social scientists in the center, consisting of geographers, economists, demographers, geomorphologists, but with a geographer's perspective. He himself was essentially a philosopher, part visionary, part dreamer, part poet, and in totality, an intellectual bindas. He had been an ardent student of philosophy, both as it was enshrined in books and as it played out in life, and taught him his lessons through his struggles while fighting injustices of all kinds. We admitted the first batch of MPhil students in 1971 and of the MA batch in 1972. Our chair today belongs to this MA batch. Professor Aijaz, that is Suhail Hashmi. Professor Aijaz joined this CSRD experiment in 1972. He brought his brand of thinking and teaching to the center. Geography at CSRD, Professor Raza first worked on the mindset of the faculty. The curriculum had to be modern, but the teachers traditional. In the curriculum, we had to do away with whatever was obsolete, but as teachers, we had to respect the old traditions of learning and teaching in the true Gurukul Shishya Parampara. It was the duty of the faculty to make the students feel like family and then strive to keep this family together. We were reminded often that each student had utility and hence a right to reach his or her maximum potential. Professor Raza would time and again tell us that a good teacher is not the one who takes a horse and teaches it to run faster, but a good teacher is one who takes a mule and teaches it to run like a horse. One thing was declared an unforgivable sacrilege, that was a teacher missing a class. Geography as a discipline was taking a turn in this decade. It was an opportune time to reinvent it. I was asked to formulate a course in urban geography and another in regional development. This was exciting. Urban geography was shifting from the ideographic to the nomothetic approach and was acquiring the apparatus of modern science, that was quantification and testing of laws, models, and theories. This resonated with the then current buzzword, socio-science. Brian Berry at the University of Chicago was riding on the cusp of the quantitative revolution in geography and was converting traditional urban geography to analytic urban geography, which was contemporary, multidisciplinary, and comprehensive in perspective. The Journal of Urban Geography was started in 1980, and urban geography had 40 specialty groups in the AAG, Association of American Geographers. The first signs of reaction to this brand of urban geography had also come in the same decade from David Harvey. And I personally myself as an urban geographer was getting very uncomfortable with the way we were teaching urban geography during the 1970s through Brian Berry's quantitative revolution. I was attracted to David Harvey's writings. David Harvey was scrapping the veneer of quantification for geography and was trying to root it in Marxist theory. He had little interest in cities as material creations. For him, cities reflected societal and political processes and were a concentration of economic wealth and political power. He refuted theory based on empirical research methods and policy recommendations that were based on social scientific research in geography. The Chicago paradigm, which had gained prominence in the 1960s, had lost it in the 1970s and the 1980s. In the field of regional development, John Friedman in 1971 finally came up with a tentative theory of regional development based on his work in Venezuela. Economic history, economic growth theories, and trade theories were being unabashedly borrowed and justified in the study of regional development. This led to a proliferation of reference material and helped me in developing a theoretical course in regional development. But that was still based on a lot of borrowed economics. After I had become a little comfortable with my teaching responsibilities, I started looking for a topic for my doctoral research. Professor Raza was my mentor. He often dropped me a hint that Indian geography was like a dinosaur with a huge body and a very tiny head. The tiny head represented theory, and the large body, the accumulation of case studies. He wanted the center to rectify the situation. During this period of probing for a thesis topic, my friends in the history department prompted me to see Dr. Chris Bailey's interpretation of colonial urbanization in India. He was a professor of imperial and Indian history at the Cambridge University. His writings were being vehemently refuted by Indian Marxist scholars. This exchange of conflicting ideas came to be referred to as the deindustrialization, deurbanization debate in Indian history. I read some of this literature and it interested me. I, however, felt that something was missing in the arguments, and that was a lack of evidence based on hard data and regional manifestation of the processes, both of deurbanization and deindustrialization. I wished to fill some of these lacunae in my thesis. David Harvey's work was gripping our attention around this period, especially my attention. I assiduously read his Social Justice and the City. It's not an easy text to navigate, but a slow, careful reading does give theoretical insights. I got clues from it to deduce a theory of colonial urbanization. It gave me an understanding of the global form of economic imperialism based on the production of surplus value. This became the pivotal point for some of the theoretical formulations in my thesis. both about colonial urbanization and about the tertiarization of the colonial urban economy, which was a proxy for deindustrialization. I supported this with data from the British census from 1872 to 1921 for the eastern half of British India. The examiner was Professor Goldsmith, a very senior Marxist geographer and a revered scholar at Cornell University in the USA, and a senior to David Harvey. I treasure his report on my work. Professor Raza's style of mentoring as a thesis supervisor meant no interference and minimal help. When I faced a mental block, say, for instance, while conceptualizing rural-urban migration in the context of colonial primate cities, in my thesis, he would ask me to read old birhas, folk songs of separation from Bihar or Eastern Pradesh. I wondered why. This suggestion made no sense to me. But when I did read some of the folk birha geet, in one of them I found that the village women called the railway trains passing by their village a sautan, the second wife, who snatches away their husbands and takes them to Calcutta. How better can a supervisor lead you to explain the agony of hundreds of rural families who faced poverty-ridden migration to colonial urban ghettos? I would sometimes share my woes with Professor Raza's way of mentoring with Ijaz Sahab. He would only give a half cynical, half amused smile in return. He knew the ways of the master. I am tempted here to narrate an incident about Professor Raza's handling of difficult students. Imagine a class, and in that class is Suhail Hashmi, a compulsive smoker those days. Moni Saab's first lecture to the class has begun. Suhail feels the urge to smoke and decides on his first strategy. His strategy was overcome your opponent, make the first move. He takes out his cigarette pack from his pocket and puts it determinedly on his desk. Then comes out the matchbox and is kept next to the pack. All this while he's eyeing the professor and the professor is eyeing him. Then in one brave attempt, a cigarette is taken out from the pack by him and it is lit. The professor quietly asks, "Akele, akele, smoking alone?" A second cigarette is then lit by the student, handed over to the prof to be accepted cheerfully by him. The class laughs and is won over. The 1970s and the 1980s saw the coming of age of the older departments in the country, led by some very dynamic geographers. These departments also tended to specialize in certain branches of geography and developed their own identities. The ones that we interacted most with, as I had said earlier, were BHU and the Allahabad University. Jaipur University had come up and it was very dynamic, and most of the North Indian universities. In South India, Pune University always welcomed us and we welcomed them, and the Madras University. The International Geographical Union's Congress in India was held in 1968 and introduced our geography departments, their faculty and their areas of strength to foreign universities. That led to an increased international interaction and has continued with financial support from the UGC and the ICSSR. CSRD also expanded and diversified. Some very eminent economists and demographers joined the faculty and enlarged its frontiers. Research interests have a ratchet effect. My research-based interaction with Indian geographers somehow waned during the 1980s because of my involvement with urban history and my doctoral work. A group of senior historians had established the Urban History Association of India in 1980, and I was made one of the founder members. I got pulled into their activities, and most of my research thereafter has been done with them. My work in geography during this period and in the subsequent decade also was linked to French universities, where I had an opportunity to teach. The French geographers form circles of affinity that largely cut across disciplinary boundaries. It has been a pleasure to work with them on esoteric subjects ranging from historical territorial identities to the use of big data and maritime trade studies. During the last decade, I found myself writing on everything but geography. This capability of multidisciplinary thinking is the power geography gives us. Urban geography in the 1990s experienced increasing fragmentation, specialization, and insularity. There have been competing versions and philosophical explorations. Los Angeles was created as a new exemplar of contemporary urban processes and of postmodernism. The material built central city has been abandoned. Attention is now diverted from metropolitan to the global, to the suburb, Silicon cities, edge cities, financial capitals, global urban networks, and the new urbanism. Urban geography in the 21st century is a cockpit of competing schools of thought. To make this diversity invigorating, debates have to be robust and healthy and not confrontational, which sometimes is happening. This has not touched Indian geography yet in a big way, and I'm glad that I have opted out of the system because, these new trends, they're so conflicting and so problematic that I don't want to torture my brain with any more thinking of this kind. When my journey as a teacher came to an end after 3 years at IIT Kharagpur, almost 45 years at JNU, and 5 years at School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, which I joined after I retired from JNU, I looked back on these decades with some awe and some remorse. I have awe at my teachers who shaped me with the brilliance of their scholarship and the firmness of their convictions. Awe at my colleagues for giving me endless hours of intellectual stimulation, humor, and poetry. Awe at my students for their achievements and for the care and warmth they give me. Remorse is only one. I could have done more. I would end by paying my homage to Professor Aijaz, a man I was privileged to know as an esteemed teacher and a valued colleague. He was a person with substance, style, and sensitivity. His sensitivity made him a profound analyst of social reality of India. We owe much to him. I express my gratitude to IIG, to Professor Sachidanand Sinha, and to Suhail for being here, and to all those who have endeavored to institute this memorial lecture series for my esteemed teacher, who deserves every honor for the scholarship he has left for generations of students and for nurturing geography, which he so loved. Thank you.
In the beginning of Atiya Appa's lecture, she had said that she had sent a draft to Sachi and Sachidanand, and she is presenting is a much edited version. Now I have one request to make, that the section that she has cut out, she should re-include, and I hope that this can be published. And because the sweep of the lecture today traces how geography has changed and how it has been influenced by what was happening abroad, and how it has taken what is relevant and modified or changed or rejected what was not relevant for us, and how that entire discipline, from the way we were taught, people of my generation were taught when we were in school, from then to where geography has reached today, this memorial lecture would actually be something that geographers should seriously read, because the way she has been able to map the entire evolution of geographical studies and the discipline of geography in the last 60 years is really remarkable. And again, I would say that we were fortunate that Atiya Appa was asked to deliver the first Aijaz Sahab Memorial Lecture. And I hope that this is continued and we get similar contributions in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. we have come to the end of the first Aijazuddin Ahmad Memorial Lecture. There is an announcement. A video on Professor Aijazuddin Ahmad shall be played now. And we are also going to begin our second parallel thematic session on public policy and geographies of social well-being in MCB room number 311. Those interested are requested to kindly proceed to the venue. Thank you.